In this video, we are going to look at the theoretical aspects of externalities. Externalities is when there are positive or negative effects on non-market participants. So we can have positive externalities which generate a benefit, and we can have negative externalities that are generating a cost. But we can also differentiate where those externalities occur, whether they are on the production side or the consumption side. So let me do a couple of examples to illustrate the difference between the various externalities here. So let me start with a negative production externality, because this is probably the best known example, or which comes to mind when the term externality is used. A negative production externality occurs if a firm engages in a production process and that there is some negative cost associated with that production process. And that cost is paid by society. So think about if you are living close to an airport, okay? You may have noise pollution, or if you're living close to a manufacturing facility, you may have noise or even smell pollution or air pollution. And you can also have environmental pollution in general, okay, from toxins that are emitted into the atmosphere or in the water or the soil. Okay, so that would be a negative production externality. There can also be a positive production externality if a firm is engaged in a production process and there are actually positive benefits to other people. Here, the prime example would be a beekeeper who produces honey, but at the same time also has pollination services or provides pollination services to surrounding farmers. Okay, and if the beekeeper does not get compensated from those pollination services, then we are speaking about a positive production externality. Now, on the consumption side, when we're talking about a positive consumption externality, then this means that consumers are engaging in consumption, and their consumption has positive effects on society. So here, in this case, an example would be rodent control. Okay, so if you take care of how many mice or how many rats you have, okay, then you are not only providing a benefit to your own home, but it has also a lower rodent population that provides benefits to your neighbors. Okay, so here in this case, rodent control would be a positive consumption externality. Now, a negative consumption externality is if a consumer engages in consumption that has negative effects or costs on other people. So here, the prime example is smoking or secondhand smoking, in the sense that if you have a smoker, a consumer of cigarettes in this case, then the negative consumption externality is in terms of secondhand smoking and negative health effects on non-smokers. Another example would be car use. Okay, so if you are using a car, you are emitting pollutants, and you are not paying for those pollutants. Okay, so this would be a negative consumption externality. Now note that in the video, we are going to have the example of a negative production externality, and we are going to look at environmental pollution, and then we are also going to look at a positive consumption externality and in the sense of rodent control. But we will also see that all those externalities are actually engaging in or leading to a deadweight loss or inefficiency. And then we are going to look at how we can solve this inefficiency. Now, from an economic perspective, the question is, how do we actually represent the positive and negative production and consumption externality graphically or from a mathematical perspective? So let us have a look at the graphs below here, okay, where I have drawn the four cases Here the positive production externality, the negative production externality, and here the same for the consumption. Okay, so let us start with the negative production externality here. So here we have what is called the PMC, or the PMC is also the private marginal cost. Okay, so this is basically the cost associated with the production of the good. Okay, so this would be what a firm actually pays in the production process. But if this production process also engages or emits pollutants, okay, or pollution, then there's an additional cost on society, and this is indicated with the social marginal cost, or SMC here. Okay, so this means that for each production unit, okay, or for each level of production, so assume we are going to have so let's have the production right here. Okay, that we have a cost that is paid by the firm, but then we also have a cost, an additional cost that is paid by society. Okay. Now for the positive production externality, okay, there we have the opposite effect. Okay, where we do not have an additional cost to society, but we have an additional benefit to society that actually shifts, or that actually results in a social marginal cost curve that is below the private marginal cost curve. Okay. Now, when we have a production externality, then we are looking at the social cost function. Okay, and we differentiate between private and private marginal cost, PMC, and social marginal cost. Whereas when we are looking at the consumption externalities, either positive or negative, then we are looking at the demand function. Okay, or under certain conditions, you can also think about this as the marginal benefit. Okay, so in the positive consumption externality case, we have a private demand function. Okay, and this is what the think about this as the rodent control, but that we also have a social marginal demand function, because what we will see is people, if there is a positive externality, people would like to have more of the good. Okay, in the sense that we will see that if you imagine this to be rodent control, then the market equilibrium occurs where the marginal cost intersects the private demand, but that people usually would like to have more rodent control. Okay, this is the social demand. The opposite is true if you are having a negative consumption externality. Now, in this case, you have the equilibrium again where the marginal cost intersects the private demand. But since there's a cost associated with the consumption, think about cigarette consumption or smoking, that people would like to have less of it. Okay, so we are going to look at how this manifests in terms of deadweight loss, and also what type of solutions can be implemented, or what type of policies can be implemented to restore efficiency, because all of those four cases of externalities all result in a deadweight loss and hence are inefficient. Now let us look at a negative production externality. So let's start off with a supply and demand graph, where we have the demand function for a good, and we also have the marginal cost function of the good. Now note here I am calling it a private marginal cost, or PMC, because this is the marginal cost associated with the production of the good that the firm or the private company observes. Now this has to be distinguished by the social marginal cost, and so because we have a negative production externality, there is an additional cost associated with this good that lies above the private marginal cost. Okay, so let's just draw this function here, and this is the social marginal cost. Now, this social marginal cost is basically what society pays for the good, and this is composed of the private marginal cost and this external cost here. Okay, so now note that the concept of externality means that market participants do not take into account the social marginal cost when they are trading in this market. So what this means is that in the case of the externality, the market equalizes private marginal cost to demand, and hence we are having a market equilibrium, which we call Q star, and we have P star. Okay, so this is the equilibrium which prevails in this market. Now, let us consider this case here, and let us calculate the producer surplus, or illustrate the producer surplus and the consumer surplus. So it would be easy to say that the consumer surplus is the area associated which is above the price, okay, and below the demand function. Okay, this is what we have seen so far. So let me just call this consumer surplus. Okay, and we will soon see that it is not quite as straightforward. And the producer surplus is the area below the price and above the private marginal cost. So this area here represents the producer surplus. Now, the problem is that in this case, we also have this social marginal cost. And then if you remember from the video where we are looking at the relationship between cost, profit, and producer surplus, then we have seen that the area below the marginal cost function, okay, represents a cost, or represents the variable cost. Now, in this case, since we are producing at Q star, okay, we also have this, not only the cost associated with the variable cost associated with producing the good, which is borne by the firm, but we also have a variable cost, so to say, that is imposed on society. And this is the cost associated with the externality. So what I mark here in red, okay, this area represents a cost. Okay, so it would be this shape here. This has to be subtracted from the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Okay, so if you're thinking about the case of social welfare here, which is usually the sum of producer surplus plus consumer surplus. So it would be the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. But now here, in this case, we have to subtract the cost associated with the externality. Let's just call this cost of externality. And the cost of the externality is equivalent to the area, to this area here. Okay. So what you can see now is that this area here is covered by a combination of producer surplus and consumer surplus. Okay? But this area here is not covered. And so it turns out that this rectangle here represents the deadweight loss associated with the externality. Okay, so this is the deadweight loss. Okay, now the question is, well, could society do better? Okay, could we restore efficiency here? And so what we are going to see next is I am going to redraw this picture, okay, in the sense that we have again this price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. We have the demand function, and then we also have the private marginal cost and the social marginal cost. Okay. Now, what I'm going to show you next is that although the market produces right here, okay, this is what we have seen in the above picture. So we have P star and Q star. Although the market produces here, this price and quantity is this is of course Q star, and of course here we have P star. Okay, so what we will see next is that the efficient production or the efficient market outcome would be at QE. Okay, I call this QE for efficient, or the efficient quantity, and also the efficient price. Okay. Now note that if society exchanges at QE and PE, then what we have is we have the consumer surplus, which is the area above here. Okay. Then we also have the producer surplus, if you will, okay, which let's say is the area here. Okay, so this is underneath the area underneath the price and above the the private marginal cost. Okay, but note that now we also have the, like before, like in this case, we have to subtract the area between the private marginal cost and the social marginal cost. So we have to subtract from social welfare the cost of the externality. Okay, so here the cost of the externality is this area shaded in red. Okay, note that what we end up with in this case is the social marginal, is the social welfare, which is represented by this triangle here. Okay, this is the social marginal welfare at the efficient price and quantity. Now, how is this different from the above scenario? Note that in the above scenario, okay, we also have, if you're looking at if you're comparing those two pictures, okay, so in this case here, you also have this triangle here, this red triangle here, this green triangle. Okay, so you have that. So those two triangles are equivalent. Okay, but in this case, when you are producing at P star and Q star, then you have this triangle here, but you have to subtract the deadweight loss. Okay, so which is smaller than just the green triangle which we have at the bottom here. Okay, so if you are able to produce at the quantity QE and PE, then efficiency is restored. Now the question is, how do you actually achieve a production quantity, or how do you achieve a market outcome which produces at PE and QE? Note that if we have a negative externality, then we are actually overproducing the good. Okay, you can see that the market is producing Q star, but it would be more efficient if we produced at QE, or the efficient outcome. Okay, so let me draw a third graph here. Okay, where again we are going to have a graph with price on the vertical axis and Q on the horizontal axis. We have the demand. We have the private marginal cost. And we also have the social marginal cost. And let me just draw this as a dashed line for the moment. So we have seen that in the absence of any intervention, that market participants are trading at Q star and P star, despite the fact that it would be better if they traded at QE, at the efficient outcome, and PE. Now the question is, how do we actually get society to this equilibrium here? Well, the solution here is what is called a Pigouvian tax. If you remember from the discussion about taxing or taxation, then what we can impose here is a per unit tax. Okay, here what this is a per unit tax in the amount of the external cost. Okay? So if you remember, if we have a tax, then what this means is that the private marginal cost, or the marginal, in the general case of a cost, the marginal cost shifts upward. Okay, this is exactly what we want. So if we are imposing a per unit tax, or a Pigouvian tax in this case, we are basically making sure that the firm internalizes the negative externality, or that the firm internalizes the cost it imposes on society. And hence we now have the social marginal cost, which would basically be the private marginal cost plus the tax. Okay, so here a Pigouvian tax imposed in the case of a negative production externality is going to restore efficiency. Now let us have a look at a positive consumption externality. And in this case, let us consider rodent control. Here we have a marginal cost function, and we also have the private demand for rodent control, and we have the social demand for rodent control. As mentioned before, if I take care of rodents in my house, then I generate a positive externality to my neighbors, because there are going to be less rodents and also less problems for my neighbors. So that is what the social demand here represents. Now, in the absence of any intervention, market participants are equalizing marginal cost with the private demand, and we end up with Q star. This is the quantity of rodent control, and P star. Okay, so that is the equilibrium. Price. But note that at this quantity, we also have a benefit to non-market participants, okay? And let's call them NMP for non-market participants, okay? So those are, for example, my neighbors. You have the consumer surplus, you have the producer surplus, but then you also have the benefit to the non-market participants, which is this entire area here. Okay? So note that the deadweight loss associated with this, with the positive externality in the absence of any intervention, is this triangle here. Okay? Because we will soon see that the optimal point of consumption, or the efficient point, should be at QE, Q efficient. So if you have a positive consumption externality, this area here represents the deadweight loss associated with the positive consumption externality. Okay? So now, when we have a negative production externality, we said that with a Pigouvian tax, we can restore efficiency. Now here, in order to restore efficiency when we have a positive consumption externality, is to actually provide a subsidy to consumers. Okay? Now note that the problem with the positive externality is that we are having an underproduction of goods, in the sense that when you have a positive externality, more should be produced, whereas if you have a negative externality, less should be produced. Okay? Now, in order to explain the concept of externality of the subsidy, the consumption subsidy in this case, I have drawn a new figure down here. Okay, because it turns out that the explanation is a little bit messy. Okay, so all I have done here is I have drawn the private demand. This is what we have seen above. I have drawn the social demand, and I have also drawn the marginal cost. And as I said before, in the absence of any regulation, we would have equilibrium at Q star and P star, but what we really want is an equilibrium at QE. Now note that in order to get to QE, we have to provide a subsidy, which I denote S here, which is the amount of the subsidy, which basically incorporates the external benefit. Okay? This is a subsidy that has to be paid to, basically paid to the market. Very much like a Pigouvian tax incorporates the negative externality. Here, in this case of the positive consumption externality, we have to subsidize the market. Now, let us have a detailed look of what exactly is going to happen in this case of subsidy when we have a positive consumption externality. Now note that I have recreated this picture on several smaller pictures here, because as I said, it is getting a little bit messy. Now, let us have a look at the case of no subsidy at all. Okay, so this is the case where we have no subsidy. And this is illustrated by this top row here. Okay, so here we are going to have first the consumer surplus, and we are going to have the producer surplus. So let's make this a little bit bigger, like this. Okay, so now when we have the no subsidy, then the consumer surplus is simply C plus D. So everything above the equilibrium price, okay, and below the private demand function. Okay. Now the producer surplus, as before, is everything below the below the equilibrium price. So it would be this area, this triangle here. Okay. But note that it doesn't stop here, because since we have a positive externality, we also have the surplus to non-market participants. Okay, so let me just say surplus to non-market participants. Okay, and this surplus to non-market participants is this area here. Okay, so it is this this green area here. Okay. Now let us have a look at the case where we have a subsidy. Okay. So here, this entire bottom is the case with the subsidy. Okay. So when we have the subsidy, the market equilibrium is actually at QE. Okay. So this is where the participants, where the market is occurring. So in this case, the consumer surplus is actually this entire area here. Okay. So from before we have C and D. Okay. But now, since consumption is subsidized, the price is lower and there is a higher consumption, and hence we also have B and J. Okay. So we have this entire area here, which is now the consumer surplus. Okay. So let me just write with subsidy. Which represents all the four figures that we are going to look at. So now with the subsidy, because we are now having a lower price, we are going to see that the consumer surplus is larger. And we also have an effect on the producer surplus, because since there is now the subsidy, also consumers are going to have, also producers are going to have a larger surplus. And this is represented by the areas underneath the price and by A, B, C, F, and G. So the new producer surplus is this area here. Okay? But note that, of course, like before, we also have a benefit to, or a surplus to non-market participants. Okay, and let me just switch this to the green color. Okay. So when we have the surplus to non-market participants, if we are producing at QE, then the surplus is this entire area here. Okay. Okay, so this now we have the surplus to non-market participants, okay, which is represented by this area here. But because we are also having an outlay in the sense that the government has to pay a subsidy, then we also have, so the three items that we have looked at so far, the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the surplus to non-market participant contributes to the social welfare. But here we also now have to subtract the cost of the subsidy. Okay, so the cost of the subsidy is simply this rectangle here, which is the quantity times the amount of the subsidy. Okay. So with the subsidy, the total welfare, the total social welfare is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus plus the surplus of non-market or two non-market participants minus the cost of the subsidy. Okay. Now you can see that this is very messy, which is the reason why I have actually numbered, put letters on those various areas. Okay, so I think it is important to keep this picture in mind, because now we can go back to the original picture and we can summarize what we have seen so far basically by using those letters. Okay, so we have said that with no subsidy, we have the consumer surplus, we have the producer surplus, and we have the benefit to the non-market participants. Okay? And in the case of no subsidy, we said that the consumer surplus is simply C plus D. The producer surplus is A plus B. And the benefit or the surplus to non-market participants is E plus F. Okay. That is the case with no subsidy and in the absence of any intervention. Now, what happens if we introduce the subsidy? So now let's look at the case with the subsidy. Okay. And again, we have the consumer surplus, we have the producer surplus, we have the benefit to non-market participants, but we also have to subtract the subsidy. Okay? So we said that the consumer surplus with the subsidy is going to be D, C, B, and J. The producer surplus with the subsidy is going to be A plus B plus C plus F plus G. Okay, so this would be this entire triangle here. And then the benefit to non-market participants would be E, F, G, H, and I. Okay, and then the subsidy, the amount of the subsidy is simply this rectangle here, which is C plus B plus F plus G, I, and J. Okay, so think about this as canceling out. Okay, so we have to cancel all those terms out. So we have, because this is the subsidy, so let's take the C here, the C here. We have a B, we have the F, the G, the I, and the J. Okay, and so then what we are left with is A plus B plus C plus D, okay, plus E plus F plus G plus H, okay? And so when you are actually looking at this in the graph, so A, B, C, D, so you have A, B, C, D, E, and then F, G, and H. So the new social welfare with the subsidy is the full triangle. Okay, so this area here now represents the social welfare with the subsidy, which is larger than the social welfare without the subsidy. Because the social welfare without the subsidy, we have this deadweight loss, okay, which with the subsidy we now have successfully captured. So hence, in this case, the subsidy, in the case of a positive consumption externality, restores welfare.